What do you need to make games these days? Do you need a degree in computer science? Do you need to have spent the last 20 years learning how to draw? Do you need to download big game engines like Unity or Unreal Engine? Or do you need to use AI? Well, you can make games out of anything. In fact, you can even make games with something as simple as with paper and pen. So during the holiday break, this is exactly what I did. I spent an afternoon making a little card game, and I wanted to share a little bit of the process of making that game in this video. Creating games out of something as simple as pen and paper is a really good way to make you think about game design. And if you're someone who's interested in creating games, I think this is the best place to start. So when we think of games today, we most often think of video games, but games have been around for thousands of years. And while in ancient times, games sort of gradually developed and changed through folk process, today a lot of games are designed either for entertainment, education, or exercise purposes. There is a massive interest these days to create video games. And, people often ask the question of like, if you want to make games, where do you start? A common answer to this question is to, just Google how to install a game engine and start fiddling around. And, while it's true that the level of entry is lower than ever for creating video games with, the internet having tons and tons of tutorials online on how to use Unity, Godot, or Unreal Engine and learn to code and all that, these are only teaching you how to implement a game. It will not actually teach you how to create or design a game. The creation of a game has to come from you, and it doesn't matter what tools you choose to use to implement the game. They're not actually as important as you might think. You still need to understand what you need to do in order to make something become a game. If anything, having to learn everything you need to be able to, get a character moving in Unreal Engine or how to write shaders in Unity, those can be big roadblocks for many. And learning how to use these tools don't necessarily teach you what you need to know. Because once you finish that 3D modeling tutorial, you're still going to need to develop the skills necessary to apply these tools to make something. It might seem like this comes for free from your own inspiration and excitement, but it really doesn't. So if you want to create video games, you're probably still going to need to learn all those technical things. And while this might be the best place to start for some, I think generally speaking, it's better to start in the other end. Start by learning what you actually need to be able to design and make a game rather than what you need to learn to be able to implement one, if that makes sense. But in order for us to be able to create a game, we must first understand what a game is. Now, I'm pretty sure that anyone watching this video have a somewhat clear understanding of what a game is, but can you define it? Can you give me a clear and concise, definite explanation of what a game is? Actually, just take a few seconds, pause the video, and think about if somebody asks you what a game is, how would you explain that to them? Form groups in the comments and discuss. When you look for what the definition of what a game is in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, you get several definitions, and I'm not going to read off every single definition here because there's a lot of them, but some noteworthy ones are a physical or mental competition conducted according to rules with the participants in direct opposition to each other. So football is a game. Or is it a sport? What's the difference there? I mean, we do say I'm watching the game when we're, watching people play football on TV. So, The manner of playing in a contest. So does that mean that you have to be competing in order for something to be a game? Does that mean that solitaire or playing Super Metroid isn't playing a game? A field of gainful activity. And this is just incredibly broad definition. Any activity undertaking or regarded as a contest involving rivalry, strategy, or struggle. And here you can kind of argue that getting elected in an election here is a game. You have your opponents, you struggle with getting people to vote for you, you need to have a good election campaign strategy, etc., etc. An activity engaged in for diversion or amusement. So watching a movie or reading a book. A procedure or strategy for gaining an end. Wait, does that mean that war is a game? So like I'm being a little bit contrarian here while reading these definitions, but maybe you get what I mean. Like these definitions don't really nail it, and it might surprise you to hear that there is no actual like official or at least commonly agreed upon definition of what a game is. Numerous different definitions have been put forward over the years, but we never seem to fully agree on like a clear and concise definition. French sociologist Roger, how do you pronounce his name? Caillois. I'm just gonna have to trust Google Translate on this one. French sociologist Roger Caillois defines games as an activity that must have characteristics including fun, be circumscribed in time and space, contain uncertainty of outcome, not accomplish anything useful for participants, be fictitious, and be governed by rules. Game designer Chris Crawford defines it as something that must be rendered as an interactive, goal-oriented activity made for money, with active agents to play against, in which players, including active agents, can interfere with each other. To quote Bernard Suits, to play a game is to engage in activity directed towards bringing about a specific state of affairs, using only means permitted by rules, where the rules prohibit more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where such rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. Other definitions include that a game is a form of play with goals and structure from Kevin J. Maroney, and Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman defines it as a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. So there are many attempts to define what a game is, but so far none of them have truly like managed to capture what the essence of a game is. Something that I believe we all kind of intrinsically understand. Is The Sims truly a game, or is it just like playing with automated dolls, a type of like simulated play? Is Detroit Become Human really a game, or is it just like an interactive movie where you get to make choices here and there, similar to like a choose your own adventure book kind of? I'm barely kind of scratching the surface of this topic here. Like I haven't even brought up the difference between game and play and all that, and I could make like an entire video essay on this topic alone, but I feel like that's kind of for another day. The thing that I want to get across here, and the thing that kind of excites me so much about the difficulty of formally defining what a game is that it means that we have a lot of room when we create and design experiences, artifacts, moments, like whatever that may fit this strange mold of what we all perceive to be a game. Like there's no real limit here. You don't have to think in terms of like what rules you need to conform to in order to create your game. In fact, I feel like it might be better not to. I'm sure that like a lot of your favorite games are those that kind of subvert your expectations. But more importantly, there are skills that are universal whether you're creating a video game, board game, or anything that falls in any of these definitions, and you can sort of learn and develop these skills without the need of a computer. The biggest benefit of designing board games or tabletop games is that the barrier of entry is so much lower, since it doesn't require you to also learn a bunch of like technical skills at this point. If your goal is to make video games, you may need to learn some of these technical skills anyways, but I kind of find that it's better to learn this after you have an understanding of what the game design process is. What tools you need to create something is kind of dictated based on what it is you're trying to create. And that leads me into why I decided to create a little card game during my holiday break. Making games is like a muscle, and I wanted to do like a little game design exercise to sort of stretch those muscles now that I am potentially about to embark on creating a new game by myself. And to make sure that I get as much as possible out of the exercise, I decided to set a few boundaries for myself. Sometimes it's much easier to be creative when there are obstructions rather than like free reign to do anything. So I decided that I was only allowed to spend one afternoon designing the like core of the game. You know, having a deadline means that I'll pursue some idea rather than like a great idea. It's easy to get stuck in the ideation process, not feeling like you've come up with like the best idea. And this exercise isn't about me designing like the best game I can, it's about designing any game. And also sometimes great games don't come from great ideas, they are born from like the process itself. The other boundary was that I was only allowed to use pen and paper. So I decided to create a card game because I don't know, I've always liked the card format. Maybe it's because I was growing up like trading Pokemon cards. Even though I don't enjoy playing card games, there's always something about it that I've always enjoyed. So I sat down on the floor and I grabbed a bunch of paper and made very rough cutouts of blank cards. I made them pretty small as I wanted to make sure I had as many cards as possible for now, since I didn't really know what my game was going to be at this point. I could have designed most of my game on the computer, saving me the headache of actually cutting the cards out for now, but I just couldn't like come up with any ideas when I was just sitting there staring at the screen. I needed to physically like write on the cards for me to get that like initial spark. So one of my initial ideas I had was that I wanted to make a game where you sort of had like 6 cards laying on the table with all the faces up, and 3 would be on each player's side. The thing there was that I wanted to make it so that like a player's hand, some of the cards were visible and some were hidden. I then wanted to pursue the idea that you had to like somehow capture the opponent's card with your own cards. I tried figuring out ways in which you could do this, and something that came up to me immediately was to use, simple addition rules. So if cards on your hand add up to the cards on your opponent's side, you would sort of capture these cards. And once the deck had been depleted, the player with the most captured cards would be the winner. I started playtesting with myself and trying to like goof around and play and see if anything emerges from that. I realized a couple of things I needed to tweak to be able to like kind of make this basic operation work. If there's no valid capture, then there needs to be some action the player can take instead during their turn. So I decided that you would be allowed to sort of draw a card from the deck if this was the case. At this point, I'm trying to figure out ways in which how to make it possible for the player to make kind of interesting decisions during play. This game doesn't really give you a lot of options in what you can do at this point. You can either take or not. So I'm really trying to figure out, where is the game? Is there a game in trying to figure out whether you should take or not during your turn? Are there any emergent properties that could make this basic interaction interesting or not? What do I need to add to this to make you feel like your decisions actually turn into some kind of tactic or strategy? I changed it so that you have to combine at least one card on your side, the ones laying face up, with one card on your hand. So the cards on your side would actually be a part of the play during your turn. I also changed it so that players have to decide like which cards on their side are laying on the field. So now cards on your own playing field are not just like a defensive line, you're actually using them as an offensive or whatever. But even still, it was very easy to just play, very defensive on your side. And to kind of combat that, I gave players the ability to sort of swap an opponent card laying on the field with one on their hand, giving players the possibility to sort of set up combo streaks and potentially ruin opponents' setups. I also decided that during your turn, you could either combo, replace an opponent card, or draw a card from the deck. I learned that there were a few times where it felt like it became frustrating to figure out like combos when there was, nothing available. So I decided to add wild cards that could be any positive value players could choose, which could be, way overpowered. I didn't really know, what ramifications it would have on the balance of the game by adding such a rule, but I decided to keep it for now and just like sort of see what happens during playtest. At this point, I wanted to figure out like how to handle the end of the game, and I tried to figure out ways where maybe players could like sit down and combo out the last couple of cards, or have some kind of extra thing they could do at the end to try and get some bonus combos out, or maybe the players could take all their cards and put them all together and see and solve like how many combos they could make together or something like that. But I couldn't quite figure something out that didn't really break the flow of the game, so I decided that the round ends on the next player's turn after the deck has been depleted. Throughout my testing, I realized that it's very advantageous to have low numbers on your end and bad to have high numbers, since there are more combinations adding up with lower values. So it could become very stale. So I added a flip mechanic where instead of addition, you could subtract cards to combo. This meant that if you had high cards on your side and you were at a disadvantage, you could flip the operation, suddenly giving you the upper hand. I added addition and subtraction cards into the deck so players could choose which mode the playing field was in. At this point, I had, for the most part, a playable game, so I started playtesting with a couple of friends to see how the game would actually play and get some feedback. The game was, of course, nowhere near done, but it's very useful to get feedback early. After the playtest, I realized that the game had a few balancing issues, which I believed were due to the amount of each card in the deck. So I tried experimenting a little bit with like how many of each card should be in there. One thing with the number combinations is that there aren't that many combinations when you combine 3 or more cards. So I had to figure out like how to make simple 2-number combinations happen more often. It's very common to have to dive a lot deeper into understanding like all the intricacies of all the elements of your game, and in this case it meant understanding like what effect all the different value cards have for creating combos. So as I said before, there is a relationship between the numbers in the game where during addition, lower numbers have a much higher yield of possible combinations to add up to. The best way that I could think of showcasing this is to put all the numbers in a table comparing all possible combinations against one another. So I slapped all the numbers into a spreadsheet matrix, and this made it very clear to me which numbers had the biggest outcome on what I was trying to improve for the game, i.e. making combos. With this in mind, I tried increasing the number of cards on the low end and the high end. The nice thing with the addition versus subtraction was that as far as I could tell, the relationship between the numbers would uniformly flip when you switch operations. So neither operation would have like an inherent advantage over either, or so I thought, and we'll get to that a bit later. One piece of advice I got during playtest was to just replace the plus-minus cards with a card that only flips the current operation, as there were a bunch of times where you would be sitting on like a lot of addition cards that didn't really give you that many options if the operation already was on addition. So I changed the plus-minus cards into flip cards. And at this point, I felt like the game was a little bit more refined, and I decided to sort of work on the next iteration of the actual like cards themselves. The game was still not really finished or anything, but I didn't want to spend that much more time working on this, as I felt like the game was, you know, in a pretty good state. Like the cards that I cut out with scissors, they were, you know, pretty ugly and really annoying to shuffle. While the cards themselves don't really change the game, aesthetics can have a pretty significant impact on our experience of games. So I decided I wanted to make the cards a little bit bigger and a little bit nicer to look at. So I started cutting out a bunch of cards with a paper cutter this time, and then spent some time designing the cards' faces. I wanted to give them like a little bit of a dual style drawing, so I made all the cards by hand with a ballpoint pen. I made sure that the faces could be read upside down, since when they're laying on the table, you want to be able to read, you know, both your own and your opponent's cards. But one thing that I discovered was, since I was drawing them by hand, the ink could shine through the cards. So I decided to draw the backside of the cards. This was a real pain in the ass, and I thought I could just like make something super basic and just color it in, or just use sleeves or something like that. But when I was researching historical card designs, I learned that artists used to draw these like very sophisticated designs on the back of the cards. And I felt like if they could do it back in those days, then I can do it now. So I spent maybe 10 hours just drawing cards, drawing the same design over and over again. And I did do most of this live on Twitch, so at least I had some company while doing this. I didn't really feel like this game was finished or anything at this point, so it really was a bit too early to spend so much time on the aesthetics of the cards, when I still felt like, you know, the game needed more work. But I thought it'd be fun, for the sake of this video, to kind of put the game through its paces and sit down and play and analyze the game with Kevin Chang, who is the game director from Box Dragon. Kevin has a long history of designing board games and have spent the last few years designing their own survival deck builder called As We Descend. So we sat down, I explained the game to him, and then we played a quick round. I've also left the rules in the description of the game if it's unclear at this point like how the game works.
All right, I will do 8 minus 2 to get the 6 on your side.
Right?
Yeah, that's it.
And then I do 10 minus 4 is 6. Is that my first? Fuck.
This is a really rough board.
It is, and we've been stuck.
For a couple of reasons. It's very interesting because this actually is very, very different compared to like the last couple of times I played it with the way the deck is balanced right now.
It's like when people get very defensive games of chess, for example, right?
So during this play session, there was a moment where the game got really stale. Like we both had high numbers on our sides with subtraction as the current operator with kind of few options to take. And this was likely due to a balancing change I had made to the deck for the session. The composition of the deck for this play session was that I had 8 cards of each of the 2s, 3s, 10s, and 9s, 6 of the 4s and 8s, and then I had 4 of each of the rest of the cards. There were 6 Operation Flip cards and 6 wild cards.
Yeah, I think this is a game where a small adjustment in the pool will actually have major ramifications on how quickly the board gets gunked up. I've noticed that there's no natural 1s in the deck.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because the deck becomes uneven. So like I couldn't get the symmetrical thing with it. And everyone I've played with have been like, why are there no 1s? Because if I added 1s, I need to have 11s too.
Yes. Now the interesting thing with 1s and 11s actually it would change the game because now on a board where there's a lot of like values that are one-off, you very rarely will have a match. Like I know you probably can't do a 9 into a 10, right? You go into the 8 into 10.
Yeah.
Reduces the amount of combos that are present. +2 to score the 9. And you replace. Then I will actually swap into a minus.
Oh my goodness.
9 minus 6 to get the 3. And now you'll see the kind of like problem with me comboing like this, because now you're gonna hate this.
Yeah, no, this is...
And you can be like, hey, I don't like that.
I'm actually kind of excited.
This is a 25. -5, 20, 13, 10, 8.
Oh, that's sick.
That's what, I was like, oh, I realized that is actually a thing. And I'm like, I don't know if that should be allowed.
That's sick.
But
no,
that feels busted.
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to make out what happened here, but basically Kevin did something I had yet to see in any of my playtests related to the wildcards up at this point. So remember when I mentioned that I didn't think there were like any inherent advantage between the addition and the subtraction operation? Well, when we were on the negative operation, Kevin figured out that if he played a really high wildcard value, he could just subtract down all the cards he had on hand until he hit one of the ones on my side, which was only possible to do during subtraction since I had decided that wildcards could only be positive values. And with that final blow, we tallied up the cards and
21.
Kevin was
29.
declared the winner. 29.
It was that final combo.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, when you first showed me the plus minus, I was like, this is going to be some fairly normal math distribution stuff. But then actually seeing how clogged the board got, I was like, wow, there's actually quite a difference between like kind of a defensive strategy playing normally with just a plus minus mechanic and just the numbers. I got quite a bit of gameplay out of here, so that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was all interesting gameplay, but there was definitely like more than meets the eye initially.
Yeah.
Like at first I was like, okay, I'm not sure. I feel like there might need to be a little more spice in here, and I probably still feel that way a little bit. But in terms of like what you were going for, which was a super fast, jammed out game with a very simple concept, I think you could pick this up and play with a lot of people. Yeah. I think it's probably serving that kind of goal. I think there are certain nice things about like having to commit something onto board in order to then make a play rather than just playing from hand. I think that is actually good because like this is the interactable state, is the stuff out here.
Yeah. Because like the pattern I'm going for is like when you're setting up combos, your opponent gets a chance to like counteract what's going on, so it doesn't become like a thing where I can just like bam, 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 just dish out like a bunch of combos.
Exactly. Like playing defensive also denies you from playing a lot of combos, which I think is actually quite a cool emergent property there.
Yeah. So like the thing that frustrated me with a little bit when I was making this game is like, it just feels like I'm not really, it feels like an algorithm, right? There's little like decision making. So that's why I started adding these rules like, oh, when you have the situation like, oh, you can pick up a card or you can switch.
It's like one of the support rules you add in to make sure the whole game flows. Yeah. It definitely felt like that, but I think it sounded like the right direction. Maybe it makes the game a little passive, and that's where you talk about interesting choices. I think
exactly.
Games have to be kind of the aggregate of how they make you feel about the choices. You don't have to be making interesting choices all the time. It's just, do you get to make enough through the course of the game that it feels kind of compelling to you?
One really interesting observation, when I did playtesting with this, I was making the comment like, I don't feel like you're making many interesting choices. and like, are you really playing a game, or are you just like automatically doing stuff? But the fact that you're doing math makes you feel like you're actually making choices, because you need to concentrate so much. Even if it's basic math, you still go through like permutations of like, yeah, I can do that, I can't do that, like, totally. Which makes it feel like you're playing a more advanced game than it is.
I think that's a great thing to touch upon. That sort of like, you're making the player go through the sort of motions of, hey, you have to still check your math. Like, you saw there were a couple of times we both paused here. I'd like to think we're both smart guys and know how to do the math, but there were still moments where we're like, okay, no, we got to kind of tally up, see if it's possible. There are moments in games where you don't make interesting choices, but it feels good going through the motions of it still.
Yeah.
I think that's still valuable. Like, you don't want a game that's all thinky and brain burning. I think players have used this phrase a lot. In board games especially, it's called analysis paralysis, right? There's too many choices on board. That's when you have a flood of interesting choices. But it feels like there was actually a bit of a mix here. It just felt like there wasn't quite enough like big combo turns, and maybe the power level of the wild card should be kind of divided over multiple things. But I think you already kind of touched upon that. You're like, the combos is the fun thing. You need to enable it as more of the normal gameplay and not as part of this like, okay, it happens one in a blue moon.
I feel like my intention is that I want there to be more combo setup.
And maybe that's enough, that you want the game to be about combos, because I'm sure when you were prototyping, there were so many other ways you could have taken the game. And I guess that's one of the things that you never really know. Like, when you're prototyping, you always have to make a choice about where you want the game to go.
Yeah.
And you can't really take all those roads untaken, because it just takes way too much time. You're not going to go through every permutation of this game. You got to commit to something, right?
Yeah.
But I think most people develop heuristics for games they play, right? Whether it's tic-tac-toe, chess, rock, paper, scissors, whatever it is, people come up with their own human algorithm, basically. This is my strategy for playing the game. Yeah. When it's complex enough, we call it a strategy. When it's kind of simple, maybe you count that as like programming. You can just follow these 3 rules, just gonna follow them, and I probably win the game if I just follow them. Which then feels maybe more like Rubik's Cube or something, just something you solve, right? Maybe this is me being too balance-brained and assuming that the game is the way it is. Wildcards are already so good that I don't even want them to have that power. That already feels too good. Like, even if they just had a range, like wildcard actually gave you the value, like this one says 0 to 5, and this one says 5 to 10, and another one says 10 to 15. Those would already still feel so potent just for their potential. You're like, oh, well, there's so many combinations you could do with ranges. But it does up the complexity by a lot, so I don't know that that's something you want. There is simplicity in the wildcard just being wild.
Yeah, and I guess that's another like element of like when you're designing the game, like, do you want it to be simple or do you want it to be complex?
Yep, and that's not like a better or worse, that's simply a, who do you want playing the game? Who do you think is gonna enjoy it the most?
Yeah, because I was thinking about that too, like, who is this game for? Like, is it for, parents playing with their children, learning like basic math?
And then you probably don't want zero, like depending on the age group, zeros are already tough, right? And then negative numbers even tougher, right?
Yeah. So. And it's like, it adds a complexity to the game where like, when you have negative numbers, but I feel like if you take away the fact that it can be negative, you lose a lot of like strategies, or like, it feels like there was a reason why I added that rule.
Yes. Now, here's a bit of a wild suggestion. Imagine how crazy the game gets actually if you have a times and divider sign. I started thinking about this since you were like different age groups learning math. Actually, if you do have a sign, so there's an X or a divisor, now suddenly, and you can use both in your operations. Yeah. Then you open up more combos as well.
Holy shit.
If there's a times and a minus, then suddenly you can be like, oh, 2 times 6, minus 10, and you get 2 on the other side of the board. Now, maybe too brain busty, but also it's quite intriguing because suddenly the combinations get so high. Like, you saw the combinations already so high just the way it is. Yeah. So it would go concurrently with the other symbol. And you could always use both symbols that are on the board. So it would always be times or divide, and always plus or minus. Yeah. And there'd be cards to flip the 2. But yeah, maybe a little too brain busty. There'd be operations that involve like so many steps.
Or if they were interchangeable, so like you don't have to use both.
Yes.
Yeah, like so you can just keep playing the game as it is right now. Exactly. But you have like the other option.
That's a great point. I think board games especially lend themselves so much to extendability. You can be like, here's the base version, and he just adds this in, and it suddenly works. You can add in a new card, a new number, ones, going negative, right?
So say that we pursue that like idea.
Yeah.
Like then the question becomes like, okay, what does the switch card switch both cards at the same time, or do you pick which one you switch?
I think you could do either, really. You could have one that's flipping both of them at the same time, or you can just choose which one to flip, or even ones that are locked to a sign. You could have the plus minus, like this one, and then a times divider.
Oh yeah, so the switcher is like switching between, yeah.
A specific operation, but it could be a targeted switch, that's fine too. I would nerf the wild card.
I kind of like the idea you had with like setting it so like wild cards, you get the value, like it's between.
It's a range.
And then you have like more wild cards.
Yes, exactly. That would allow you to have quite a few more wild cards. And maybe wild cards don't exist at every range. Maybe there are certain numbers that only exist on hard numbers, like a 1 and a 5 and a 10, or these hard set numbers. But then wild card exists in that squishy 2 to 4 range, and then this 6 to 9. I think there's a lot of ways to go with it. The reason why I think normally I don't hammer on a balance point so much, because I think easily changing something like the multiply rule, something like changing the distribution of numbers in your deck, adding zeros, ones, that's already going to wildly throw out the balance. But I think wildcard is one of those things that will always feel like super busted as long as it can go, because the ceiling is so high on it.
Yeah.
And it's always going to come down to who drew it. Like you kind of said it earlier. If the game had this like redraw instantly effect and you could kind of just combo through the deck, wildcard almost feels on that level of busted, to me at least. Of course, this will depend on who you ask, but it feels like you don't get to do the math anymore. I think you also said that. You're like, hey, you don't have to think about the math anymore. It's going to work, right?
Like the rules that exist right now, they kind of exist because there's an idea of like, oh, there's a lot of thought process that goes into like how you're setting up your side, but it's random to the most part. You don't really control too many elements, even if it feels that way. You're still at the luck of the draw and based on what's on the other side, and you constantly want to be defensive and mess up the other player. There needs to be these kind of like possibilities for players to disrupt the game, I feel like.
Totally.
For it to not become too stiff.
Yeah, because otherwise the tempo then is I score, you score, I score, you score, and we could keep going back and forth, and that feels very rote. It's going back to the idea of like, are you just an algorithm playing the game, right? I think these haymakers, even if they're busted, they at least disrupt the flow of things. So that's actually a great point. And maybe that ties into the zaniness of like, again, the multiply divide example. Where do you want your zaniness? Yeah. Do you want it at a system level where it's like, oh, the game systems are all just naturally very chaotic. They allow you to have lots of chaos. But if it's a very rigid system, like it's plus or minus, one deck, just numbers, then suddenly you're like, okay, we kind of want some wildness somewhere else. We want it in the cards. We want it in some player ability that's super powerful, right? Yeah. Like you could imagine a version of this game where it's still the same, but you have a math hero, math blaster, and they have a special ability that lets you do some odd operation that's atypical, right? Like I get to use my 10s as 1s in my operations. And suddenly that opens up one player doing a very asymmetric thing to the other player. And that's a totally wild way to take the game. It's just like, where do you want to put your wildness, right? Yeah.
The wild card and like the chaotic side of it, like if you want to introduce more chaotic elements to the game, or if you want to reduce the chaotic element and keep it more like streamlined and you're doing things. Yeah. And I think this game can be a little bit more on the chaotic end. Stealing cards, it feels like it's, like you mentioned, it's more advantageous to just grab another card. The setup is so like surgical. Like you only change one card.
Yeah. Imagine if it was like swap any number of cards on the border. Something wild like that, right? Yeah. As long as you don't have players just swapping stuff back and forth.
If you have free reign to do it, it's one thing. If it was like, if you had a card that dictated like when you can do it, then it's fine, because then you can do the thing where like if we both have plus minus switches and I'm like, I really want to stay on negative and you want to be on positive, then we can do that like duke out and be like switch back and forth, and that's fun.
And I think I especially like that the plus minus you could combo afterward. I think that is something that you would introduce by having a card that is the swapperoo, because then you could swap and then immediately combo from there, rather than having to kind of wait this awkward turn. Like the payoff isn't that good. But that goes back to your question you were asking, like, is it too algorithmic? It's hard to answer that other than knowing in your heart, do you feel like it's too algorithmic? And it sounds like you definitely lean in that direction.
I feel like it is.
Yeah.
And like, I buy the argument that like, it still feels like you're playing a game and it's fun because you're still actively thinking. Like I feel like in Uno, for instance, you're just sitting there with like, you're just waiting for it to happen, and this happens too, but the fact that you're doing math fools you into thinking that you're actually,
it's more involved than it is.
The most important thing to do when doing any playtest is to try and be observant and not interject too much in the player experience. Like, let the current iteration of the game speak for itself, because you need to let go of your ego and ask like the hard questions of whether your game lives up to what you set out to accomplish.
You can be totally honest. Do you think the game was fun?
It was okay fun. It was medium fun. Sorry.
Yeah. But the thing is, I also don't think.
Yeah, that's okay.
Like, I agree with you though. Like, I don't think
it's not as fun as I wish it were, which sounds like a bit of a weird thing to say. Yeah. And I'm sure some people would find it enjoyable, but I don't know if it's that kind of like exuberant, like, yes, let me go another round. Which I think is actually the real question to ask. Usually you just ask, do you want to play another round?
Yeah, that's true. It's true.
The thing that made it super fun is talking to the guy designing it, getting this whole conversation out of it, enjoying the sort of process. I think that stuff is fascinating.
You know, if you don't enjoy making games, then you're not gonna make games.
Like, no. You cannot make games hoping to have your dream game. Like, that is not a reason to make games. You gotta make games because you love making games, whatever comes out the other end, because you're gonna get stuff like this. In fact, I would say you actually need more stuff like this in order to let your brain go free and become better as a designer, because if you're always taking the safe way, I'm only going to ship a game if it's ultra fun. I'm only going to make something if it's ecstatically fun. And you're just going to be paralyzed by that.
So if there's only one thing you take away from this video, I hope it's just this. Like, in order to make games, you have to learn how to enjoy making games. I hope this video gave you all some insight into game creation and maybe inspired you to create your own little game, maybe? Or feel free to keep iterating on the game that I've left off with here. I'd definitely be curious to see, what you would change to make this game more fun. If you made it to the end, thank you very much. This definitely turned into a much bigger video than I anticipated, so kudos to you for getting here. You get a little star sticker. Until next time, everyone, take care.